Imagine standing in the golden light of the desert, the pyramids towering above you, their stones casting shadows that stretch across centuries. They look eternal, proud monuments of human genius, of kings who dreamed of outlasting time itself. But behind that breathtaking beauty lies a truth almost too dark to comprehend. A truth carved not in stone, but in the bones of women whose lives were consumed to build that glory. Every polished block, every glittering artifact, every echo of ancient hymns was purchased with the suffering of enslaved women whose stories were never meant to be told. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and pain, if you find yourself drawn to the hidden corners of history, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I am always amazed that we can explore these ancient narratives together, no matter where we are in the world, united by our curiosity about the past. They were erased from texts, omitted from temple carvings, discarded without names. And yet, their bodies kept the record, a hidden archive of pain waiting thousands of years to be uncovered. What if the real story of Egypt isn't only one of dazzling innovation and mighty pharaohs, but one of blood and silence, where unimaginable suffering was reframed as divine order? Tonight, you and I are going to walk through that silence together, peeling back layers of sand and myth to confront the hidden history of women condemned to serve forever, in life and even beyond death. Picture a teenager, ripped from her home in Nubia, stumbling barefoot through the crowded streets of Thebes. The sun beats down on her back, the iron brand still fresh on her skin. Her hands are bound, and she can barely keep her balance as the overseer's whip cracks inches from her face. She does not know that her journey will not end here, that the chains she wears now will bind her for the rest of her life. She does not know that one day, thousands of years later, archaeologists will find her bones buried in an unmarked pit, her skeleton bent and broken from decades of forced labor. Her story is not carved in hieroglyphs or written in papyrus. Her story is written in her knees, locked at unnatural angles from years of kneeling at a grinding stone. It's written in her spine, twisted and compressed by endless toil. It's written in her teeth, ground flat from swallowing grit and dust with every breath. This girl and countless others like her built the foundation of one of history's greatest civilizations. Yet her name has been lost to the wind. Only the damage done to her body remembers her now. When we think of Egypt, we imagine grandeur. We think of golden burial masks, colossal temples, and pharaohs who believed themselves gods. But none of that splendor could have existed without the labor of enslaved women. They carried the water that softened the earth. They hauled the baskets of stone and dirt that raised colossal monuments skyward. They cooked the food for armies of workers, wove the linen for royal households, nursed children who were not their own, and bore children who would themselves inherit chains. They were the invisible workforce that powered eternity. And the truth is, they were not just enslaved in life, many were enslaved in death. In the earliest dynasties, when a king died, his servants were expected to follow him into the afterlife. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically, through ritual murder. Imagine being dressed in your finest rags from the slave quarters, given one final meal, and led into a chamber filled with others. Some were forced to drink wine laced with opium, their bodies slowly succumbing to poison as their hearts slowed and their vision blurred. Others were strangled with cords, the evidence still visible centuries later in the grooves left in their vertebrae. Some had their throats cut. They were lined up in rows, arranged as if asleep, their hands positioned in eternal service. Young concubines were buried closest to the king, expected to provide him with pleasure forever. Domestic servants, their grinding stones and cooking pots buried beside them, were placed next, condemned to work for eternity. Supervisors, older women tasked with keeping order, were arranged in outer circles. Death itself became another chain, another collar, another prison. And this was not rare. Archaeologists uncover mass burials where entire groups of women were sacrificed to accompany a single ruler. For a time, human lives were simply another resource spent in the service of eternity. Only later did figurines, the small Shabti statues, begin to replace real women as substitutes. But even then, the transition was slow, incomplete. Some dynasties still sacrificed living women, while others merely forced enslaved women to contribute pieces of themselves, strands of hair, drops of blood, fragments of bone mixed into figurines so that even in life they were offering up pieces of their bodies for eternal bondage. The economics of this system were as brutal as the rituals themselves. Slave traders learned that young, healthy women fetched higher prices if they were deemed suitable for sacrifice. Parents sold their daughters knowing they would die in tombs because the price might keep their other children alive. Families were broken apart by forces they could not resist. For those selected, there was no escape. They were isolated, fed better food than usual, dressed in garments that passed for finery, and made to participate in prayers thanking the gods for the honor of dying. Imagine being forced to give thanks for your own murder, to be told your death was privilege while knowing deep down that you were nothing more than a possession, destined to be buried alive or strangled in a dark chamber. Scratches on tomb walls, skeletons twisted out of ritual positions, and broken bones show that some resisted, that some fought back against impossible odds. But against the machinery of royal power, resistance was futile. The system consumed them all. The horror of these sacrifices did not disappear overnight. Even as rulers moved toward using figurines instead of flesh, the practice of burying real women persisted. In some dynasties, women who died naturally during a pharaoh's lifetime were embalmed and stored away, their mummified bodies left waiting in storage chambers for years until the moment their master died. Only then were they pulled out and buried alongside him, as if even in death their bodies were just another possession, to be used whenever convenient. Imagine the indignity of being treated as an object in life, only to have your corpse stacked in a storeroom like pottery until your master required your presence in his eternal household. The tombs themselves became death traps. At Dare, the village of tomb builders, enslaved women labored alongside craftsmen, preparing the chambers that would one day hold kings and queens. When the construction was completed and the tombs sealed, some of these women were left inside. Archaeologists have found their skeletons in narrow passages, arms outstretched, mouths frozen in silent screams. Whether by design or by accident, they were entombed alive, their last breaths stolen by darkness and stone. To the ancient Egyptians, this was not a tragedy. It was a necessity. The belief that slaves would continue to serve in the afterlife meant that women could not be allowed to die freely. They had to die at the right moment in the right place to ensure their eternal availability. If a master was sick and near death, terminally ill women were brought close to the tomb, kept alive until the exact moment he passed, then slaughtered so they could cross into eternity together. Time itself was twisted into another shackle, their deaths synchronized for perfect servitude. Even queens demanded the companionship of enslaved women in the afterlife. Queen Nethotep's tomb held the bodies of young women who had been buried alive, their hands clawing at sealed stone as the oxygen vanished. They died slowly, desperately, in pitch-black tombs so that a queen would never feel loneliness in eternity. Think of that. Human lives snuffed out not for survival, not for defense, but for comfort to ease a royal's fear of solitude in death. The Egyptians left spells etched into tomb walls, magical texts meant to control the spirits of servants in the afterlife. These spells are chilling because they don't just describe servitude, they anticipate rebellion. They warn against the possibility of enslaved spirits rising up, of striking back at their masters after death. The Egyptians feared their slaves so deeply that even in death they sought to control them, to bind their will forever. This reveals something important. The people who built Egypt's greatness, who carried its stones and cooked its food and bore its children, were never trusted to rest. Even in death, they were considered dangerous, needing spells to break their spirits, to keep them in chains for eternity. And the cruelty was not reserved for grown women alone. Children, some as young as 5 or 6, were sacrificed to play the roles of eternal companions. Their tiny skeletons, buried with painted faces and miniature adult clothing, have been found in royal tombs. These little girls were transformed into toys for eternity, their innocence twisted into servitude. Archaeologists have discovered them arranged as if playing or working, as though their childhood was nothing but a rehearsal for endless bondage. Imagine the terror of a child torn from her mother, dressed in ceremonial makeup, and led to a tomb where she would be killed all so that a royal could pretend they had family in the afterlife. Every aspect of this system was calculated. Women were not chosen randomly. They were examined like livestock. Their health was checked, their skills assessed. Could they weave, cook, soothe, perform sexual acts? Whatever talents they had in life determined their fate in death. To the Egyptians, these women were not people. They were tools. Their bodies were assets. Their abilities measured only in terms of how useful they would be in eternity. Even their murders were dressed in ritual. Before they were killed, they were paraded through ceremonies that blended honors with humiliations. They were given food they had never tasted before, clothing finer than anything they had ever worn. But alongside these gifts came relentless isolation. They were cut off from their communities, stripped of solidarity, and told to prepare themselves joyfully for their own destruction. They were forced to chant prayers of gratitude for the privilege of being sacrificed. Imagine the psychological torment. To know you were about to die, to know your life meant nothing, and to be compelled to thank your killers for the chance. And yet, the human spirit resists. Evidence shows that not all of these women went quietly. In one First Dynasty tomb, a woman's skeleton bears defensive wounds, broken bones in her arms, scars left from trying to block blows, proof that she fought back even as death closed in. Scratches on stone walls revealed desperate struggles, nails clawing at unyielding rock. These voices of resistance, faint but undeniable, echo across millennia. They remind us that these women were not passive shadows. They resisted in the only ways they could, even though resistance meant only a different kind of death. Against the machinery of empire, their defiance could not save them, but it could leave a trace, a testimony etched in bone and stone that refuses to be silenced. The system itself bred an economy of horror. Traders recognized that healthy, skilled young women could be sold specifically for sacrifice. Their market value soared not because of their lives, but because of their deaths. Families sold daughters into this fate, their despair dulled by hunger, their choices shaped by survival. Payment for a single girl could mean food for the rest of the family for months. And so the marketplace for sacrificial humans flourished alongside the markets for grain, cattle, and gold. Human lives became commodities, bartered and sold not for labor, but for ritual death. When human sacrifice began to fade, it was not because of moral awakening. It was because it was inefficient. A dead slave produced no grain, wove no linen, bore no children. The rulers of Egypt realized that living slaves were worth more than dead ones, and so figurines, paintings, and symbolic rituals replaced the real bodies. But even these so-called substitutes still carried traces of enslaved women's suffering. Tomb paintings depicting servants were often based on real women forced to pose for endless hours, their aching bodies used to capture images that would doom them to eternal service in painted form. Figurines were sometimes mixed with fragments of women's bodies' hair, blood, ground bone, binding them to servitude in both life and death. To be enslaved in Egypt was to be consumed, piece by piece, until nothing remained that was truly your own. The silence of these women stretched across thousands of years, but bones do not lie. When archaeologists sift through the sands, when they carefully brush away centuries of dust, what they uncover is not just artifacts, but the lives that artifacts tried to erase. The skeleton of a woman bent unnaturally at the spine tells of decades hunched over a grinding stone. Deep grooves in her knees reveal the countless hours she spent kneeling on hard floors, turning grain into flour for masters who never knew her name. Her teeth, worn to flat stumps, tell us she lived on rough bread filled with grit and stone dust, a diet that cut her gums and wore away her enamel. This is her biography, written not on papyrus, but in her body. Another woman's skull shows healed fractures from repeated blows, proof that punishment was a constant companion. Others carry marks of malnutrition, evidence that while they labored to feed others, they themselves were starved. Each skeleton is a testimony, each fracture a sentence in a hidden story the pharaohs never wanted told. For centuries, the image of Egypt was carefully curated. Ancient propaganda, carved into temple walls and painted in dazzling colors, showed obedient servants smiling as they carried baskets of food, poured wine, or played music for their masters. These images were designed to convince not only the living, but also the gods that the order of society was just. But archaeology tells a different story. The smiles painted on walls are masks. Behind them, the women who lived those roles suffered endlessly. Their labor built palaces. Their bodies nourished royal bloodlines. Their lives were traded, used, and discarded. The propaganda was a mask over an empire of pain. The psychological devastation cannot be measured in bones alone, but it can be imagined. Enslaved women were cut off from their families, stripped of names, denied the basic bonds of human connection. Many were branded or tattooed with marks of ownership, their skin used as a living record of their subjugation. To be branded was to lose not only your freedom, but your very identity. You were no longer someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's mother. You were property. And yet, these women carried children in their wombs, children who would be born into the same system, inheriting chains before they even drew their first breath. The cycle repeated endlessly, generation after generation, until slavery itself became invisible in the grand narrative of Egypt's glory. Think of the emotional torment of mothers forced to raise the children of their masters while their own children were sold away. Imagine the hollow ache of a girl who knew that the child she carried would never be hers, that her baby's fate was already sealed by the moment of conception. Slavery stole more than labor. It stole love, family, and the right to hope. That is perhaps the most devastating truth. Not only were these women's bodies controlled, but their very emotions, their capacity to love and belong, were weaponized against them. Their silence in the historical record is not an accident, it was engineered. Pharaohs, priests, and scribes worked tirelessly to erase them from history, because to remember them truthfully would have meant admitting that Egypt's greatness was built on blood and tears. Modern Egyptology is beginning, slowly, to restore these erased lives. Scholars examining burial pits once thought to be for criminals are now recognizing them as the graves of enslaved women. Tombs once celebrated for their intricate carvings are now being studied for the faint scratches left by desperate hands. Skeletal analysis, chemical testing, and forensic reconstruction are giving these women voices once more. Their stories are finally being told, not through the words of kings, but through the unbroken testimony of their bodies. Science has become a form of justice, however delayed, peeling away the lies of propaganda to reveal the truth beneath. Yet we must ask, why does this matter to us today? Because history, when told only through the eyes of the powerful, becomes a lie. For centuries, we glorified Egypt as a land of gods and geniuses, without asking who carried the stones, who wove the linen, who died in the shadows of the pyramids. To tell the story of Egypt without telling the story of these women is to participate in the same erasure the pharaohs began. Their suffering is not just a footnote. It is the foundation of everything we admire about that civilization. Without them, there would be no pyramids, no temples, no golden masks. Their labor, their lives, their deaths, this is the hidden cost of eternity. And so, as we look at the glittering treasures displayed in museums, as we marvel at the precision of stonework and the complexity of hieroglyphs, we must also hear the echoes of those whose names we will never know. The truth is not comfortable. It should not be. These monuments are not only marvels of engineering. They are gravestones for countless women sacrificed in silence. Their blood still stains the sand, invisible but eternal. When we stand before the Great Pyramid, we see a wonder of the ancient world. But what we should also see is a grave. Every stone, perfectly aligned, was set in place by hands that bled. Every ramp that lifted stone higher into the sky was built on backs bent to breaking. The desert winds whisper not only of kings and gods, but of women whose voices were stolen, whose names were buried deeper than any tomb. These enslaved women were not given monuments. They were not mummified with care or preserved with oils. They were erased, denied even the basic dignity of remembrance. But erasure is never perfect. Their bones, their trauma, their silent testimonies have outlasted the lies of the pharaohs. What the scribes ignored, the earth preserved. What kings tried to silence, time has carried forward. The truth reframes everything we think we know about ancient Egypt. The pyramids are not just feats of engineering, they are monuments to human bondage. The golden masks of pharaohs are not just treasures, they are artifacts bought with human suffering. The temples at Luxor and Karnak are not just sacred sites, they are echoes of women's screams buried in stone. Egypt's greatness was real, but so was its cruelty. One cannot exist without the other. To tell the story of ancient Egypt honestly is to give back the humanity stripped from these women. It is to recognize that their labor built civilization, their suffering made possible the monuments we admire, and their deaths were the unacknowledged sacrifices on which eternity was founded. They may not have names in our records, but they deserve to be remembered as people, not as shadows. And so, the next time you look at a pyramid, a tomb painting, or a golden artifact, look closer. See beyond the stone, beyond the art, beyond the myth of kings. See the women who ground the grain, who wove the linen, who carried the water, who bore the children, who bled into the sand. See the women who were silenced, but who are now, finally, beginning to be heard. Because history's true power is not in monuments. It is in memory, and remembering these women is the justice they were denied in life. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, Hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.